In the autumn of 1850, when the leaves turned crimson as dried blood, and the Missouri wind carried whispers of winter, Martha Reddick gave birth to her first and only son. The midwife who delivered him, old Sarah from the creek bend, would later swear on her grandmother's Bible that something felt wrong from the very first breath the child drew. Not wrong in the way of sickness or deformity, but wrong in a way that made her ancient hands tremble as she cleaned the baby's perfect pink skin. They named him Silas, after Josiah's father, a man who had lived to see 90 summers before the earth claimed him. It seemed a good omen then, to give the boy the name of someone who had known such a length of days. How could they have known they were bestowing upon their son the cruelest of ironies? The town of Ashford, Missouri was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. Dirt roads connected humble farms, and the church bell marked time for a community that lived by the rhythm of seasons and the will of God. It was a place where peculiarities were noticed, discussed, and eventually either accepted or cast out. There was no middle ground for strangeness in Ashford. For the first year, Silas appeared as normal as any child. He cried when hungry, smiled when held, and grew according to nature's design. Martha would rock him by the firelight, singing hymns her own mother had sung, while Josiah worked the fields that would provide for their small family. They were devout people, the Reddicks, who believed that faith could weather any storm, and that God's plan, however mysterious, was always just. But by his second birthday, the neighbors began to notice something unsettling. While other children in Ashford grew rounder, taller, their baby features giving way to the sharper angles of childhood, Silas seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. His face, which should have been losing its infant softness, grew more cherubic. His stumbling toddler steps became more uncertain rather than more confident. "That boy's not thriving," whispered Mrs. Henderson across her garden fence to Mrs. Cole. "There's something not right about the way he carries himself." By age 3, the whispers had grown into conversations. By age 5, they had become accusations. Silas looked no older than a child of 2, his voice still carrying the lisp of a baby, his movements growing more uncertain with each passing season. It was as if time itself had turned backward for him, unwinding the natural progression that marked every other living thing. Martha and Josiah sought explanations. They consulted the town doctor, who examined Silas with growing bewilderment and found no disease, no malformation, nothing that medical science could name. They prayed longer, harder, their knees worn raw against the rough wooden floor of their bedroom. They fasted and begged God for understanding, for healing, for anything that might restore their son to the natural order. The neighbors were less charitable in their explanations. "It's a curse," declared Tom Morrison, whose own son had grown from infant to strapping farmhand in the same years that Silas had seemingly shrunk. "That family has brought something unholy into our midst." "I've heard tell of such things," added Sarah Whitman, her voice dropping to the hushed tones reserved for speaking of the devil's work. "Children born backward, touched by something that ain't of this world. They say it's a sign of judgment coming." By the time Silas reached his 10th birthday, he appeared no more than 6 years old. His clothes hung loose on his diminishing frame, and Martha had taken to sewing smaller and smaller garments, her fingers trembling as she worked by candlelight. The boy, who should have been helping his father in the fields, could barely manage the simple tasks of a young child. But it was not just his body that seemed to be retreating into infancy. His memories, too, began to fade like morning mist. Hymns he had once sung with clear understanding became confused mumblings. Names of neighbors he had known since birth slipped from his tongue like water through cupped hands. It was as if his very essence was being slowly erased, rolled backward like a scroll being wound closed. The most disturbing moments came when Silas would stand before the mirror in Martha's bedroom, staring at his reflection with eyes that seemed far too old for his shrinking face. He would tilt his head, studying the stranger looking back at him, as if trying to recognize someone he had once known but could no longer place. "Mama," he said one evening, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of childish pronunciation and ancient sadness that had come to characterize his speech. "Who is that boy in the glass?" Martha's heart broke a little more each day. She would hold him close, feeling how small he had become, how light, as if he was slowly becoming less substantial, less real. Josiah grew quieter, more distant, spending longer hours in the fields where he could avoid the questioning stares of neighbors and the weight of his wife's desperate prayers. The final straw came on a Sunday morning in late autumn. As the Reddick family walked toward the church, Silas stumbling on legs that seemed to remember less about walking with each passing week, a group of children ran past them, laughing and shouting in the careless way of youth. One of them, a boy named Timothy, who was the same age as Silas, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw him. "Ma says you're cursed," Timothy announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. "She says you're going backward to hell." The words hung in the crisp air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Other families, dressed in their Sunday best and heading toward worship, turned to stare. Some crossed themselves. Others hurried their children along, as if whatever afflicted Silas might be catching. That night, as Martha tucked her son into the bed that seemed to grow larger around him with each passing week, Silas looked up at her with eyes that held depths no child should possess. "Mama," he whispered, "I remember being bigger. I remember knowing things. But it's all going away, like water down a drain." Martha smoothed his hair, noting how fine and soft it had become, like the downy covering of a newborn. "Don't you worry about that, sweet boy. Mama's here." "But for how long?" Silas asked, and in his voice was a question that cut deeper than any blade. "If I keep getting smaller, keep forgetting, what happens when there's nothing left of me to remember?" As Martha blew out the candle and darkness claimed the room, she wondered the same thing. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the oak tree that had stood sentinel over the Reddick farm for generations. And in that wind, if you listened closely enough, you might have heard the sound of time itself, flowing backward like a river that had forgotten which way it was meant to run. But here's what haunts me most about Silas Reddick's story, and what should keep you awake tonight. If a child can grow backward through time, losing pieces of himself with each passing day, what does that tell us about the nature of time itself? Are we all just borrowing our moments, our memories, our very selves from some cosmic force that might at any moment decide to take them back? And if it happened to one boy in Ashford, Missouri, what's to stop it from happening again? Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon, because some mysteries demand to be shared and some truths are too terrifying to face alone. The drums of war began beating in the spring of 1861, their rhythm carrying across the Missouri countryside like the heartbeat of some great wounded beast. Fort Sumter had fallen, and the nation was tearing itself apart along lines that had been drawn in blood and principle. Young men from Ashford gathered at the general store, their voices raised in heated debate about duty, honor, and the righteousness of their cause. But while the country aged rapidly under the weight of conflict, Silas Reddick continued his impossible journey backward through time. At 11 years of age, he now appeared no more than 4, his small frame dwarfed by clothes that Martha had sewn and re-sewn, each iteration smaller than the last. His voice had taken on the lisping quality of a toddler, though his eyes still held that unsettling depth that seemed to peer through the veil of ordinary reality. The war provided an unexpected shelter for the Reddick family's secret. With attention focused on the great conflict tearing the nation apart, there was less scrutiny of the strange boy who seemed to shrink with each passing season. Neighbors had more pressing concerns than the peculiarities of one child. Their own sons were marching off to fight, and the very fabric of their world was unraveling. Josiah felt the pull of duty like a physical weight on his shoulders. He was 35, still young enough to carry a rifle, still strong enough to serve the cause he believed in. But how could he leave Martha alone with their mysterious son? How could he abandon them to face the suspicions and fears of the community without his protection? The decision was made for him on a humid July evening when Sheriff Bradley came riding up the dirt path to their farmhouse. The lawman dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave with the weight of unwelcome news. "Josiah," he said, removing his hat and wiping his brow, "I'm afraid I've got orders. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 45 is being called up. No exceptions this time." Martha stood in the doorway, Silas clinging to her skirts like the child he appeared to be, though his grip carried a strange strength that seemed to anchor her to the earth itself. She watched her husband's shoulders slump as the reality of separation settled over them like a burial shroud. "When?" Josiah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Week's end. You'll join up with the Missouri volunteers heading east." That night, as Josiah packed his meager belongings into a worn canvas bag, Martha lay awake listening to the sounds that had begun to follow Silas in the darkness. It had started months ago, whispers that seemed to drift through the walls, conversations in voices she couldn't quite identify. At first, she had dismissed them as the product of her exhausted mind, the hallucinations of a mother stretched beyond her limits by worry and sleepless nights. But the whispers had grown clearer, more distinct. They came from the fields beyond the house, low voices speaking in cadences that felt both ancient and urgent. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be answered by another voice, a small childish voice that she recognized as belonging to her son. "Silas," she would call softly when she heard him stirring in the night. "Are you having a bad dream, sweetheart?" "Not dreams, Mama," came his reply from the darkness. "Talking. They want to know about the time I took." "Who wants to know, baby?" But Silas would never answer that question directly. Instead, he would curl closer to her in their small bed, his body so slight now that he barely made an impression on the mattress, and whisper things that made her blood run cold. "They say I have to give it back," he would murmur against her shoulder. "All the time I took from myself, they say it belongs somewhere else." Martha would hold him tighter then, as if her embrace could keep him anchored in the present moment, preventing him from slipping further back into whatever impossible regression held him in its grip. The morning of Josiah's departure broke gray and humid, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an army of shadows. The family stood together at the edge of their property, where the dirt road led toward town and the gathering point for soldiers. Other families were saying their goodbyes, wives clinging to husbands, children too young to understand reaching up for fathers they might never see again. "You watch over your mama," Josiah said, kneeling down to Silas's eye level. The boy's face was so young now, so unmarked by the passage of years, that it seemed like looking at a ghost of childhood itself. "You're the man of the house now." Silas nodded solemnly, but when he spoke, his words carried that eerie prescience that had become his most unsettling characteristic. "You won't come back the same, Papa. The war will take pieces of you, just like something's taking pieces of me." Josiah's face went pale, but he forced a smile and tousled his son's hair. "Don't you worry about such things, boy. Just mind your mother." As Josiah's figure disappeared down the road, Martha felt the weight of isolation settling around her and Silas like a physical thing. They were alone now, more vulnerable than ever to the suspicions and fears of their neighbors. And those fears were growing stronger with each passing day. The first incident happened 3 days after Josiah's departure. Mrs. Henderson came calling in the early evening, claiming she had heard crying from the Reddick property the night before, not the crying of a child, but the wailing of an infant, high and desperate and somehow wrong. Martha assured her that Silas had slept peacefully through the night, but she could see the doubt in her neighbor's eyes. "That boy ain't natural," Mrs. Henderson said bluntly as she prepared to leave. "Mark my words, Martha. No good can come of harboring something that defies the Lord's design." The second incident was more serious. Dr. Samuel Blackwood, a physician from St. Louis who had heard whispers of Silas's condition, arrived unannounced one afternoon with a leather bag full of instruments and a determination to examine the boy. He was a man of science, he explained to Martha, and he had traveled considerable distance to study what he called temporal anomalies in human development. Martha refused to let him near Silas, but Dr. Blackwood was persistent. He offered money, promised discretion, even suggested that his studies might lead to a cure for whatever afflicted her son. When Martha continued to refuse, his manner turned threatening. "This child represents a violation of natural law," he declared, his voice rising with conviction. "If you won't allow proper scientific study, then perhaps the authorities should be made aware of what you're harboring here." That night, Martha woke to the smell of smoke. She rushed outside to find Dr. Blackwood's wagon burning in her yard, his papers and instruments feeding the flames. The man himself was nowhere to be found, but his horse stood nearby, wild-eyed and trembling. On the ground where the doctor should have been lay only his medical bag and a single sheet of paper, the edges already curling in the heat. Martha managed to snatch the paper before the flames could claim it. In Dr. Blackwood's careful handwriting, she read the words that would haunt her for the rest of her days. "This child should not exist. The natural order has been violated. God help us all." As the wagon burned down to ash and ember, Silas appeared beside her, his small hand slipping into hers. He watched the flames dance with an expression of satisfaction that looked utterly foreign on his childish features. "Did you do this?" Martha whispered. Silas tilted his head, considering her question with the gravity of someone much older. "I protected us, Mama, just like Papa said I should. But how could a boy who appeared no more than 4 years old have overpowered a grown man? How could he have known enough to destroy the doctor's research before it could be used against them?" Martha looked down at her son's innocent face and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, and the whispers from the fields began again, ancient voices calling to her son, in words she couldn't understand, voices that seemed to promise answers to questions she was too afraid to ask. And Silas, her baby boy who grew younger with each passing day, tilted his head toward those voices and smiled with a knowledge that no child should possess. The war might be raging across the country, consuming young men in its insatiable hunger for blood and sacrifice. But here in Ashford, Missouri, a different kind of battle was being fought, a war against time itself, with a small boy at its center, and the very nature of reality hanging in the balance. Dr. Alistair Munro arrived in Ashford on a Tuesday morning when the October fog hung thick as burial shrouds between the trees. Unlike his predecessor, Dr. Blackwood, who had come with the arrogance of a man convinced he could catalogue and explain all mysteries, Munro moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had already seen too much of the inexplicable to dismiss anything as impossible. He was a tall man, lean to the point of gauntness, with prematurely grey hair and eyes the color of winter sky. His medical bag was worn but well maintained, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years treating ailments that existed in the shadowy spaces between science and superstition. Martha first encountered him at the general store, where she had gone to purchase the smaller and smaller clothing that Silas now required. At 12 years of age, her son now appeared no more than 3, his tiny frame swimming in garments that would have fit a toddler. The other women in the store fell silent when she entered, their conversations dying like flames snuffed by a sudden wind. "Mrs. Reddick," Dr. Munro said, approaching her with a slight bow that spoke of old-world manners. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Martha's first instinct was to flee, to gather her purchases and retreat to the safety of her farm. But something in the doctor's manner, a gentleness that had been absent from Dr. Blackwood's aggressive curiosity, made her pause. "What do you want with us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To help if I can. To understand if you'll allow me to." They spoke in hushed tones while the other women pretended not to listen. Dr. Monroe explained that he had heard of Silas's condition from colleagues in St. Louis and whispered accounts of a child who seemed to defy the natural progression of time. He admitted that Dr. Blackwood's disappearance had only heightened the medical community's interest in the case. "What happened to him?" Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "No one knows for certain. His horse returned to St. Louis without him. There were reports of a fire, but no remains were ever found." Dr. Monroe studied her face carefully. "I suspect there's more to that story than has been told." Martha agreed to let him visit the farm, though every instinct screamed against trusting another outsider with their secret. But the isolation was wearing on her, the weight of carrying Silas's mystery alone growing heavier with each passing day. Perhaps this doctor, with his gentle manner and careful questions, might offer some hope where others had brought only fear. Dr. Monroe's first visit to the Reddick farm lasted 3 hours. He examined Silas with infinite patience, noting the boy's physical regression with the methodical precision of a scientist and the wonder of a man witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "Remarkable," he murmured, listening to Silas's heartbeat through his stethoscope. "The cardiac development appears consistent with that of a 3-year-old, despite his chronological age. It's as if his entire physiology is moving backward through time." But it was not just the physical aspects of Silas's condition that captured Dr. Monroe's attention. He spent long minutes observing the boy's behavior, the way his movements seemed uncertain despite his years of experience walking and running. Most disturbing of all was the gradual erosion of Silas's memories and abilities. "Can you recite the alphabet for me, Silas?" Dr. Monroe asked gently. The boy tried, his brow furrowing with concentration, but he could only manage the first few letters before trailing off into frustrated silence. Martha watched with a breaking heart as her son struggled to access knowledge that had once come easily to him. "It's like watching a book being unwritten," she whispered to the doctor. "Every day he forgets something else. Yesterday he couldn't remember the name of our old dog Rex. He loved that dog more than anything." Dr. Monroe made careful notes in a leather-bound journal, his handwriting precise and economical. But Martha noticed that he often paused in his writing, staring at Silas with an expression that mixed scientific fascination with something deeper and more troubling. "Doctor," Martha said during his 3rd visit, "you look at my son sometimes like you're seeing something that frightens you. What is it?" Monroe set down his pen and regarded her with those winter sky eyes. "Mrs. Reddick, in my years of practice, I have seen many conditions that challenge our understanding of human development. But what is happening to Silas? It defies not just medical knowledge, but the fundamental laws that govern existence itself." "Are you saying he's not human?" "I'm saying he may be more human than the rest of us. Human in a way that reveals truths about our nature that we were never meant to see." It was during his 4th visit that Dr. Monroe made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had been observing Silas play in the yard, or rather, attempting to play, as the boy seemed to have forgotten how to engage with his wooden toys in any meaningful way. As Monroe watched, Silas began to speak, apparently to himself, in a voice so soft that the doctor had to strain to hear. "I remember the big place," Silas was saying, his childish voice carrying an odd cadence. "The place where I was before I was small. There were others there, like me but not like me. They're waiting for me to come back." "Silas," Dr. Monroe called gently, approaching the boy. "Who are you talking to?" Silas looked up at him with those impossibly deep eyes. "The ones who know about time. They say you're trying to understand something you can't understand. They say it will make you sick in your head if you keep trying." Monroe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What do they tell you about time, Silas?" "That it's not a river flowing one way, like people think. It's more like a big wheel, turning and turning. Sometimes people fall off the wheel, and they have to find their way back to where they started." "And is that what's happening to you? Are you finding your way back?" Silas nodded solemnly. But I'm scared, Dr. Monroe. What if I go back so far that I forget how to be? What if I just stop? That night, Dr. Monroe sat in his room at the Ashford boarding house, writing by lamplight in his journal. His hands trembled as he recorded the day's observations, and more than once he had to stop to steady himself with a measure of whiskey from his medical supplies. The boy speaks of time as if he has intimate knowledge of its structure, he wrote. His regression appears to be not merely physical, but existential. It is as though he is being slowly erased from reality itself, unwound like a thread being pulled from a tapestry. He paused in his writing, listening to the night sounds of the small town, dogs barking in the distance, the creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through bare branches. But underneath these familiar sounds, he thought he could hear something else. Voices, speaking in languages that predated human speech, calling to something or someone in the darkness beyond his window. Dr. Monroe closed his journal and walked to the window, peering out into the night. In the distance he could see a faint glow emanating from the direction of the Relic farm, as if the very air around the property were suffused with an otherworldly light. As he watched, the glow pulsed gently, rhythmically, like the breathing of some vast sleeping entity. "What have you gotten yourself into, Alistair?" he whispered to his reflection in the glass. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Martha came to town with Silas in tow, the boy now so small that he had to be carried like an infant. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and fear, her eyes red from sleepless nights. "Dr. Monroe," she said, approaching him outside the general store. "I need to tell you something. About Silas. About what's been happening." They found a quiet corner of the store where they could speak without being overheard. Martha's voice shook as she told him about the voices in the night, the conversations between Silas and entities that existed beyond the reach of ordinary perception. She described the incident with Dr. Blackwood, the mysterious fire that had consumed his research and possibly the man himself. "I think my son is connected to something," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched. "Something that exists outside our understanding of the world. And I think that connection is both killing him and keeping him alive." Dr. Monroe listened in silence, his scientific mind struggling to process information that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of reality. When Martha finished speaking, he sat quietly for a long moment, staring at Silas, who was curled in his mother's arms like a child half his chronological age. "Mrs. Relic," he said finally, "I want you to know that I believe you everything you've told me, every impossible detail. I believe it all. And that terrifies me more than I can express. Can you help him?" Dr. Monroe met her desperate gaze with his own troubled one. "I don't know. But I swear to you, on my oath as a physician and my honor as a man, that I will find a way, even if it costs me everything I have, everything I am, I will find a way to save your son." But as he made that solemn promise, Silas stirred in his mother's arms and looked directly at the doctor with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of ages. When the boy spoke, his voice carried a sadness that seemed to echo from the depths of eternity itself. "You can't save me, Dr. Monroe," he whispered. "But maybe I can save you." The winter of 1862 descended upon Ashford like a shroud woven from ice and desperation. News from the war fronts came sporadically, each dispatch bringing fresh sorrow as families learned of sons who would never return home. The town's young men were dying in distant fields, their blood watering the earth of battlegrounds whose names would echo through history. Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg. In the face of such overwhelming loss, the community's grief had curdled into something darker, more dangerous. Silas Relic, now 13, but appearing no older than a child of 2, had become the focal point for all of Ashford's fears and frustrations. In a time when death was claiming so many young lives in their prime, the sight of a boy moving backward through time felt like a mockery of natural order, an insult to the very concept of mortality itself. Pastor Edmund Rawlings had been preaching increasingly fervent sermons about signs and portents, his voice rising to thunderous heights as he spoke of divine judgment and the need for the community to purge itself of unholy influences. A man in his 60s with wild grey hair and eyes that burned with the fervour of absolute conviction, Pastor Rawlings had arrived in Ashford just as Silas's condition was becoming impossible to hide. "There walks among us an abomination," he declared from his pulpit one frigid Sunday morning, his words echoing off the rough-hewn walls of the church. "A child who defies the Lord's design, who mocks the natural progression that God himself ordained. How can we expect his blessing on our cause, his protection for our boys in battle, when we shelter such blasphemy in our midst?" The congregation, hollowed out by loss, and desperate for someone to blame for their suffering, hung on every word. Martha had stopped attending services weeks ago, unable to bear the hostile stares and whispered accusations, but the pastor's words reached her anyway, carried by neighbors who felt it their Christian duty to ensure she understood the gravity of her situation. Dr. Monroe had remained in Ashford far longer than he had originally intended, his obsession with Silas's condition growing stronger with each passing day. He had rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, converting one room into a makeshift laboratory where he conducted experiments that would have horrified his colleagues in St. Louis. He was studying time itself, he told Martha during one of his visits, trying to understand the forces that held her son in their impossible grip. "I've been corresponding with natural philosophers in Boston and New York," he explained, his eyes bright with the fever of discovery. "Men who study the fundamental nature of reality itself. They speak of theoretical possibilities, temporal anomalies, disruptions in the fabric of existence that might explain what's happening to Silas." But Martha had grown wary of the doctor's intensity. She noticed how his hands shook when he examined Silas, how his eyes had developed a haunted quality that reminded her uncomfortably of her son's own otherworldly gaze. Monroe was being changed by his proximity to Silas's mystery, shaped by forces that she was beginning to suspect were beyond human comprehension. The first act of violence came on a bitter February night, when the moon was dark and the wind howled like the voices of the damned. Martha woke to the sound of shattering glass and rushed to Silas's room to find rocks scattered across the floor, winter air pouring through the broken window. Her son sat up in his small bed, tears streaming down his cherubic face, looking more like an infant than ever before. "They threw stones, Mama," he whispered, his voice so young now that it broke her heart to hear it. "They called me bad names." Martha wrapped him in blankets and carried him to her own bed, where they huddled together until dawn. When morning came, she found a crude message painted on the side of their barn in what looked like dried blood: "Send the demon back to hell." The attacks escalated from there. Women would cross themselves and hurry their children away when Martha appeared in town. Men would spit on the ground and mutter curses under their breath. The general store began refusing to serve her, claiming they had no goods to spare for devil worshippers. But it was the children's reactions that cut deepest of all. The few young ones who remained in Ashford, boys too young for war and girls sheltered from its horrors, had begun to gather in groups outside the Reddick property. They would stand at the edge of the yard, staring at the house with the morbid fascination of youth confronting the incomprehensible. "Come out backwards, boy," they would chant. "Come out and play with us." When Silas did emerge carried in his mother's arms because walking had become increasingly difficult for him, the children would scatter like startled birds. But their fear was mixed with cruel curiosity, and they always returned, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing something that defied everything they had been taught about the world. The breaking point came during the third week of February, when Pastor Rawlings organized what he called a prayer vigil outside the Reddick farm. Nearly 24 townspeople gathered in the frozen yard, carrying torches and prayer books, their breath visible in the frigid air, as they recited verses about casting out demons and cleansing the community of evil. Martha watched from behind her curtains as the crowd grew larger and more agitated. Pastor Rawlings stood at their center, his arms raised toward the darkening sky, his voice carrying across the winter landscape with the force of righteous fury. "Lord God Almighty," he cried, "we beseech thee to cleanse this place of unnatural corruption. Drive out the evil that has taken root here. Restore the natural order that this abomination has violated." The crowd took up the chant, their voices blending into a harsh chorus that seemed to make the very air vibrate with hostility. And then, as if summoned by their collective rage, something extraordinary happened. The temperature around the house began to drop, far beyond what even the bitter February night could account for. Frost spread across the windows in impossible patterns that looked like ancient script. The torches held by the mob flickered and dimmed, their flames turning from orange to an eerie blue-white. Most disturbing of all was the sound that emerged from the house itself, not a crying or screaming, but something far more unsettling. It was the sound of an infant's laughter, high and sweet, and utterly wrong in the context of the angry mob outside. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the frozen ground and bare trees with supernatural resonance. The crowd fell silent, their chanting replaced by the rapid breathing of people, confronted by something beyond their understanding. Pastor Rawlings himself stepped backward, his torch wavering in his suddenly unsteady grip. "What devilry is this?" he whispered, his voice no longer carrying the authority of divine conviction. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant howling of wolves. But the message was clear: whatever force protected Silas Reddick was not something that could be driven away by prayer and righteous anger. The mob dispersed quickly after that, their torches casting wild shadows as they hurried back to the safety of their homes. But Martha knew that their retreat was temporary. Fear had a way of festering in small communities, growing stronger and more dangerous with each passing day. That night, as she held Silas close to her heart, listening to his increasingly shallow breathing and feeling how light he had become, she made a decision that would change everything. She could no longer protect her son from the growing hostility of their neighbors. The town had turned against them completely, and it was only a matter of time before fear transformed into violence that even Silas's mysterious guardians might not be able to deflect. "We have to leave," she whispered to Dr. Monroe when he arrived for his evening visit. "They'll kill us both if we stay." But Dr. Monroe shook his head, his gaunt features etched with a determination that bordered on obsession. "You can't run from this, Martha. Whatever is happening to Silas, it's tied to this place, this moment in time. If you take him away now, you might sever the connection that's keeping him alive." Alive? Martha looked down at her son, who appeared to be sleeping, but whose eyes moved constantly beneath closed lids, as if he were witnessing events in some other realm. "Look at him, doctor. He's disappearing before our eyes. How is this living?" Dr. Monroe knelt beside the bed, studying Silas with the intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail of a miracle he might never see again. "Because he's not just regressing, Martha. He's transforming, moving towards something that exists beyond our normal understanding of existence. And what if that something is death? Then we'll follow him as far as we can," Dr. Monroe replied, and in his voice was a conviction that frightened Martha more than all the mob's threats combined. "Even if it costs us our sanity, our souls, our very humanity, we'll follow him to the end." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the faint sound of voices, ancient, patient, and utterly inhuman, calling to the boy who grew younger with each passing night. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the house, Martha thought she could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, as if something long dormant was finally beginning to stir. The stranger arrived in Ashford during the 3rd week of March, when the last of winter's ice was melting into muddy streams, and the first brave shoots of spring grass were pushing through the thawed earth. He came on foot, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel, and wearing the tattered uniform of a Confederate soldier. but there was something in his bearing that suggested he had long since abandoned any allegiance to earthly causes. His name, he told the few townspeople brave enough to approach him, was Ezekiel Marsh. He claimed to be a deserter from the Army of Tennessee, a man who had seen enough of war to know that some battles were fought on fields that existed beyond the reach of cannon and rifle. His face was scarred by more than combat, deep lines etched by experiences that had marked his soul as surely as shrapnel had marked his flesh. Ezekiel had heard whispers of Silas Reddick even in the war camps, stories passed from soldier to soldier like ghost tales around a campfire. A boy who grew backward through time, who spoke with voices that existed before the world was made, who might hold the key to mysteries that armies of scholars had failed to unlock. Such stories traveled far in a time when the impossible seemed to happen daily, when the very fabric of the nation was being torn apart by forces beyond any one person's control. Martha first encountered him outside the general store, where she had gone to purchase the increasingly small garments that Silas required. At 14 years of age, her son now appeared no older than 18 months, his tiny body requiring infant clothes that she had to travel to neighboring towns to find. The sight of this stranger, with his piercing green eyes and prematurely gray hair, filled her with a familiar dread. "Mrs. Reddick," he said, removing his battered military cap with a gesture that might once have been courtly. "I believe we need to speak about your son." "I don't know what you're talking about," Martha replied automatically, the lies coming as easily as breathing after months of practice. Ezekiel smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Ma'am, I've traveled 200 miles to reach this place, following stories that most folks would dismiss as the ravings of men driven mad by war. But I've seen things in my travels, witnessed events that convinced me such stories might hold more truth than fiction." He gestured toward a small cafe across the street, one of the few establishments in Ashford that still served strangers without too many questions. "Perhaps we could discuss this over coffee. I have information that might interest you." Against her better judgment, Martha found herself sitting across from this enigmatic stranger, studying his weathered features while he spoke in low, urgent tones about things that chilled her blood. "I encountered a boy like yours once before," Ezekiel said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth from its contents. "Down in Georgia, near a plantation that had been burned out by Sherman's march. The family had hidden in the woods, all except for one child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, though the neighbors swore she had been born 15 years prior." Martha's breath caught in her throat. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared one night, just vanished like morning mist. But before she went, she told me something that I've never forgotten. She said there were others like her, scattered across the country, all moving backward through time toward some great convergence." "Convergence?" Ezekiel leaned forward, his green eyes intense with conviction. "A gathering, Mrs. Reddick. A moment when all these impossible children would return to whatever source had created them. She called it the unwinding, and said it was necessary to prevent something terrible from happening to time itself." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. "You're saying Silas isn't unique? Are there others?" "Were others. Most of them have already completed their journey, returned to whatever realm spawned them. Your son may be among the last." The stranger's words confirmed fears that Martha had been harboring for months. She had begun to suspect that Silas's condition was not some isolated curse or medical anomaly, but part of something larger and more purposeful than she had dared imagine. "What do you want?" she asked. Ezekiel's expression grew serious, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are men, Mrs. Reddick, learned men who have been studying these temporal anomalies for years. They have facilities and resources that could help your son complete his journey safely." "You mean they want to take him away?" "I mean they want to understand what he represents, and in understanding perhaps find a way to preserve something of who he is before he disappears entirely." Martha stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "My son is not some specimen to be studied. He's a child who needs his mother. Is he? Ezekiel asked quietly. When you look at him now, do you see a child? Or do you see something wearing the shape of childhood? Something that remembers being your son but is becoming something else entirely? The question hit Martha like a physical blow, because it echoed doubts she had been trying to suppress for weeks. Silas was changing in ways that went beyond mere physical regression. His speech patterns had shifted, incorporating words and concepts that no infant should understand. His eyes held depths that seemed to peer through layers of reality, seeing things that existed beyond the reach of normal perception. "Think carefully about my offer," Ezekiel said, rising from his own chair. "These scholars I represent, they're not like that fool doctor who disappeared. They understand that your son is precious, that he represents something sacred that must be protected. And what if I refuse?" Ezekiel's smile returned, cold and calculating. "Then you'll watch him fade away piece by piece, taking with him secrets that could change humanity's understanding of existence itself. Is your maternal love worth condemning the world to ignorance?" That evening, Martha sat beside Silas's crib, for he was now too small and too fragile to safely sleep in a regular bed, watching his tiny chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. Dr. Monroe had arrived for his evening examination, but his presence provided little comfort. The physician's obsession with Silas's condition had grown to frightening proportions, his studies consuming him to the point where he barely slept or ate. "The stranger spoke to me today," Martha told him quietly. "He says there are others like Silas, that this is part of something bigger." Dr. Monroe looked up from his notes, his eyes bright with feverish interest. "Others? How many? Where are they now?" "Gone, according to him. Silas might be one of the last." "Fascinating," Monroe murmured, then caught himself. "Forgive me. I don't mean to sound callous. It's just, the implications are staggering." Martha reached down to touch Silas's forehead, noting how warm his skin felt despite the cool night air. "The stranger wants to take him away, to some facility where he can be studied." "Absolutely not," Monroe said firmly. "Silas belongs here, with people who care about him as more than just a scientific curiosity." But even as he spoke those words, Martha could see the conflict in his eyes. The scientist in him was intrigued by the possibility of learning more about Silas's condition, even as the man recoiled from the thought of surrendering the boy to strangers. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from the crib. Not crying, but something more disturbing. Silas was speaking, his infant voice forming words that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "The man with green eyes," he whispered, his tiny hands grasping at empty air. "He's not what he seems. The things he serves, they hunger for more than knowledge." Martha and Dr. Monroe exchanged worried glances. Silas's episodes of otherworldly communication had been increasing in frequency and intensity, as if his regression through time was bringing him closer to whatever source had originally created him. "What do they hunger for, sweetheart?" Martha asked gently. Silas turned his head toward her, his infant features twisting into an expression of ancient sorrow. "Time itself, Mama. They want to feed on the years we've all lost, to grow fat on the moments that slip away from everyone." Before either adult could respond, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching the house. Martha peered through the window to see Ezekiel Marsh standing in their yard, his scarred face illuminated by moonlight. He wasn't alone. Shadowy figures lurked at the edges of the property, waiting with the patience of predators. "He's come for his answer," Dr. Monroe observed grimly. Martha looked down at Silas, who had fallen silent but whose eyes remained open and alert, staring at something neither adult could see. At that moment she realized that her son had been trying to warn them that the stranger's offer was not the salvation he claimed it to be. "Then he's going to be disappointed," she said, moving to ensure the door was securely locked. But as the night deepened and the figures in the yard began to move closer to the house, Martha wondered if her refusal might have condemned them all to something far worse than Ezekiel's bargain. Outside, the wind began to howl with voices that sounded almost human, and in his crib, Silas began to weep with tears that seemed to fall upward, defying gravity as surely as his existence defied time. The confrontation that would determine their fate was coming, and Martha could only pray that the mysterious forces protecting her son would prove stronger than whatever hunger drove the strangers in their yard. Dawn broke grey and cold over Ashford on the morning they found Ezekiel Marsh's body. The stranger who had come seeking Silas lay twisted in the muddy field behind the Reddick farm, his scarred face locked in an expression of terror so profound that even hardened men crossed themselves when they looked upon it. Sheriff Bradley, called to investigate the death, could make no sense of what he discovered. "Never seen anything like it," he confided to Doc Peterson, the town's aging physician, who had been summoned to examine the corpse. "Body's all wrong somehow. Bones feel as brittle as chalk. Skin looks like it's been drained of something vital." Doc Peterson knelt beside the dead man, his weathered hands probing gently at limbs that seemed almost hollow beneath their covering of flesh. "It's as if he aged decades in the space of a single night," he murmured. "Look at his hair. It was grey when he arrived, but now it's white as snow. And his teeth." The doctor's voice trailed off as he peered into Marsh's gaping mouth. The teeth, which had appeared normal just days before, were now yellowed and cracked with age, several having fallen out entirely to lie scattered in the mud like discarded pearls. Sheriff Bradley removed his hat and scratched his graying head. "You think the Reddick boy had something to do with this?" "I think," Doc Peterson said carefully, "that there are forces at work in this town that are beyond my understanding, and maybe beyond anyone's understanding." The news of Marsh's death spread through Ashford like wildfire through dry grass. The townspeople, already on edge from months of strange occurrences surrounding the Reddick family, began to speak in hushed whispers of curses and supernatural revenge. The stranger had come seeking something from the backwoods boy, and now he lay dead in a field, aged beyond his years and twisted by forces that defied explanation. Martha learned of the death from Dr. Monroe, who arrived at her farm that morning, with his face pale and his hands trembling. He found her in the kitchen, trying to coax Silas to take some milk from a bottle. The boy was now too small and too regressed to manage solid food, appearing no older than a newborn, despite his 15 years of life. "The stranger is dead," Monroe announced without preamble. "Found in your back field this morning, looking like he'd been aged by decades overnight." Martha's hands stilled on the bottle. "How?" "That's what everyone wants to know. Sheriff Bradley is asking questions, and some of the townspeople are saying—" He paused, glancing at Silas, who seemed to be listening despite his infant appearance. "They're saying your son killed him somehow." "That's impossible. Silas can barely lift his own head, let alone harm a grown man." But even as she spoke the words, Martha remembered the night before, the sound of voices in the darkness, the way Silas had suddenly fallen silent in his crib, and the strange dreams that had plagued her sleep. Dreams of shadows moving through moonlight, of time itself bending like heated metal, of something ancient and hungry prowling the edges of their property. Dr. Monroe pulled up a chair beside her, his medical bag forgotten as he studied Silas with the intensity of a man trying to solve an equation that defied all known mathematics. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed anything different about Silas's episodes lately?" Martha considered her words carefully. "He speaks more frequently now to things we can't see. And sometimes when he's having one of his conversations, the temperature in the room changes. It gets cold, like winter's crept inside." "Anything else?" She hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only path forward. "Yesterday evening, just before that stranger appeared in our yard, Silas told me something. He said the man with green eyes wasn't what he seemed, that the things he served were hungry for time itself." Monroe leaned forward, his eyes bright with scientific curiosity tempered by growing fear. "Time itself?" Those were his exact words. And then he said something else, something that chilled me to the bone. He said they wanted to feed on the years we've all lost, to grow fat on the moments that slip away from everyone. Dr. Monroe was quiet for a long moment, staring at Silas, who lay in Martha's arms like any normal infant, except for the ancient wisdom that seemed to peer out from behind his tiny features. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. "Martha, I think your son isn't just regressing through time. I think he's become a conduit for something that exists outside our normal understanding of temporal flow, something that can manipulate the very fabric of chronology itself." "You're saying he killed that man by aging him to death?" "I'm saying that whatever force is responsible for Silas's condition might be capable of more than we ever imagined. If it can make a child grow backward through time, what's to prevent it from accelerating someone else's journey forward?" The implications of his words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Martha looked down at her son, this tiny creature who had once been her laughing, playing boy, and tried to reconcile his current helplessness with the possibility that he might be connected to forces capable of killing a grown man through temporal manipulation. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would these forces protect us now when they've been letting Silas waste away for years?" Dr. Monroe shook his head slowly. "Maybe they weren't protecting you. Maybe they were protecting themselves. If Marsh really did represent some organization that wanted to study and possibly exploit Silas's condition, then his death might have been self-defense on a cosmic scale." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from outside, raised voices and the sound of multiple horses approaching the farm. Martha peered through the window to see Sheriff Bradley riding up the path, accompanied by several townspeople including Pastor Rawlings and Tom Morrison. The men's faces were grim with purpose, and several carried ropes and farming implements that could easily serve as weapons. "They're coming for us," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Monroe stood quickly, moving to the window to assess the situation. "At least a dozen, maybe more. We need to get Silas out of here. Now." "But where could they go?" Martha looked around the small farmhouse that had been her home for more than a decade, at the simple furnishings and familiar comforts that would have to be abandoned. In her arms, Silas stirred restlessly, his tiny face scrunching up as if he were preparing to cry. "Mama," he whispered, his infant voice somehow carrying clearly through the chaos of her thoughts. "They can't hurt me where I'm going, but they can hurt you." The words sent a chill down Martha's spine. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I'm almost ready to leave," Silas continued, his baby features taking on that otherworldly expression that had become so familiar and so frightening. "The place I came from, it's calling me back, but you can't come with me, Mama. Not yet." Outside, Sheriff Bradley's voice boomed across the yard. "Martha Reddick, you come out here right now. We need to talk about what happened to that stranger." Dr. Monroe grabbed his medical bag and moved toward the back door. "Is there another way out of here?" Martha nodded, shifting Silas to one arm while she gathered the few possessions they could carry. "There's a path through the woods that leads to the creek. We can follow it downstream to the old mill road." But as they prepared to flee, Silas spoke again, his words stopping them in their tracks. "The bones," he said, his infant voice carrying an odd sing-song quality. "They looked for his bones, but they found only dust, because time ate them up, chewed them down to nothing, just like it's doing to me, but backward instead of forward." Martha stared at her son in horror, finally understanding what Dr. Monroe had been trying to tell her. Silas wasn't just a victim of some temporal anomaly, he was becoming something else entirely, something that existed at the intersection of time and eternity, and that something was far more powerful and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "We have to go," Dr. Monroe urged, but Martha found herself frozen by the implications of her son's words. If Silas could somehow drain the time from another person, leaving only brittle bones and ancient flesh, what else might he be capable of as he completed his impossible journey backward through existence? And when he finally reached whatever destination awaited him, what would become of the world he left behind? Outside, the voices grew louder and more demanding, but inside the small farmhouse, time itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether love or fear would ultimately determine the fate of the boy who grew younger with each passing day. The church bells of Ashford had not rung for 3 days, not since old Tom Brennan, the bell ringer, had fled the town after claiming he heard voices speaking backward Latin from within the bronze depths. The silence hung over the community like a shroud, broken only by the whispered prayers of the faithful and the increasingly frantic preparations for what Pastor Rawlings had declared to be a final cleansing of unholy influences. Martha and Dr. Monroe had managed to evade the search parties that scoured the countryside, taking shelter in an abandoned root cellar near the creek, while Silas continued his impossible regression. At 16 years of age, her son now appeared to be barely a month old, his tiny body so fragile that Martha feared even the gentlest touch might cause him to simply dissolve like morning mist. Yet despite his apparent helplessness, or perhaps because of it, Silas had begun to demonstrate abilities that defied every law of nature Dr. Monroe thought he understood. The temperature around the boy would fluctuate wildly, sometimes dropping to near freezing within moments. Shadows moved without any visible source to cast them, and Martha had twice awakened to find small objects floating in the air around her son's makeshift cradle. "It's accelerating," Dr. Monroe observed, his voice hoarse from days of hiding in damp conditions. "Whatever process is governing his regression, it's moving faster now." Martha adjusted the blanket around Silas, noting how his breathing had become so shallow it was barely perceptible. How much longer? Days, maybe hours. His vital signs are approaching those of a newborn, but there's something else happening. Something I don't have the knowledge to measure or understand. As if responding to their conversation, Silas opened his eyes that now seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of ages, despite being set in the face of an infant. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but the words carried with supernatural clarity. "Today," he said simply. "It ends today." Martha felt her heart clench with a mixture of terror and desperate love. "What ends today, baby?" "My journey backward, your journey forward. The moment when all the stolen time gets returned to where it belongs." Dr. Monroe leaned forward, his scientific mind still grasping for understanding even in the face of the incomprehensible. "Returned to where, Silas? Where does time belong?" But before the boy could answer, they heard the sound that would change everything. The church bells of Ashford, ringing with a frantic urgency that spoke of desperate faith and mounting hysteria. The sound carried across the countryside like a call to arms, summoning the faithful to what Pastor Rawlings had promised would be their final confrontation with the forces of darkness. "They're gathering," Martha whispered, recognizing the particular pattern of the bell tolls. She had heard it only once before during the great fire that had nearly consumed half the town when she was a child. Dr. Monroe peered out from their hiding place, scanning the horizon for signs of movement. "We should stay hidden until it passes." But Silas stirred in his mother's arms, his infant features taking on that otherworldly expression that had become all too familiar. "No," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible, coming from such a tiny form. "I have to go to them. It's time." "Absolutely not," Martha said firmly. "I won't let them hurt you." "Mama," Silas replied, and in that single word was a depth of love and sorrow that broke her heart. "They can't hurt me anymore. But if I don't go to them, if I don't finish what was started, then everyone will be hurt. Everyone, everywhere, for all time." The weight of his words settled over them like a burial shroud. Martha looked down at her son, this impossible child who had been the center of her world for 16 years, and realized that she was about to lose him forever. Not to death, exactly, but to something far more profound and terrible. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice breaking with the effort of speaking. "Carry me to the church," Silas whispered. "Let me see their faces one last time before I go home." The walk back to Ashford felt like a funeral procession. Martha carried Silas wrapped in the softest blanket she could find, while Dr. Monroe walked beside them with his medical bag clutched in trembling hands. The countryside around them seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself was waiting for some cosmic resolution. As they approached the town, they could see that nearly every remaining resident had gathered around the church. Pastor Rawlings stood on the front steps, his arms raised toward the gray sky, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the fervor of a man who believed he was fighting for the very soul of his community. "Lord God Almighty," he cried, "we beseech thee to grant us strength in this final hour. Drive out the corruption that has taken root among us. Restore thy divine order to this place." The crowd responded with fervent amens and hallelujahs, their voices blending into a chorus of desperate faith. But when Martha emerged from the tree line carrying Silas, a profound silence fell over the assembly. The boy in her arms no longer looked entirely human. His skin seemed to glow with an inner light that was neither warm nor cold, but something altogether. His tiny features were perfect in the way that only the very young or the very divine could achieve, and when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice carried across the churchyard with supernatural resonance. "I have come," Silas announced, his infant voice somehow audible to every person present, "to return what was borrowed, to complete what was begun, to make whole what was broken." Pastor Rawlings descended the church steps slowly, his earlier confidence wavering in the face of something that transcended his understanding of good and evil. "What are you?" he whispered. Silas turned his head toward the pastor, and when he smiled, it was with an expression of infinite compassion mixed with cosmic sadness. "I am what happens when time forgets which way it flows. I am the correction to an error that threatened to unmake everything." The air around them began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The temperature dropped precipitously, and several people in the crowd gasped as their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. But it was not just cold that touched them. It was the sensation of time itself becoming fluid, malleable, uncertain. "You see," Silas continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone much older, much wiser, "there was a crack in the foundation of existence, a flaw that allowed time to leak out, to pool in places where it didn't belong. I was sent to gather it up, to carry it back to where it needed to be." Dr. Monroe stepped forward, his scientific mind still seeking understanding even in the face of the miraculous. "Sent by whom?" Silas laughed then, and it was the laughter of an infant, but also the laughter of something ancient beyond human comprehension. "By the same force that makes your heart beat, that pulls the tides, that holds the stars in their courses, by the thing you call God, though that word is too small for what it truly encompasses." The laughter seemed to trigger something profound. The church bells began to ring again, but now their sound was different, deeper, more resonant, as if they were tolling not just across space but across time itself. And with each peal of the bells, Silas grew smaller, younger, more translucent. "It's happening," Martha whispered, clutching her son closer to her heart. "Mama," Silas said, his voice already beginning to fade, "remember me as I was, not as I am becoming. Remember the boy who laughed and played and dreamed of growing up to be like his papa." Around them, the assembled townspeople watched in awe and terror as the impossible child began to dissolve before their eyes. But it was not a dissolution into nothingness. It was a transformation into something else, something that existed beyond the boundaries of physical reality. As Silas faded from view, the stolen time he had been carrying began to return to its rightful owners. The crowd felt it first as a tingling sensation, then as a profound sense of restoration, as if years of their lives that they hadn't even realized were missing, were suddenly flowing back into their bodies and souls. Pastor Rawlings fell to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face, as he felt decades of lost moments returning to him. "Forgive me," he whispered to the space where Silas had been. "I didn't understand. I couldn't see." But Martha barely heard his words. She was staring at the empty blanket in her arms, at the place where her son had been just moments before. There was nothing left of him now, except the fading echo of his laughter and the warmth that still lingered in the fabric that had held him. "Where did he go?" she asked Dr. Monroe, her voice hollow with grief and wonder. The physician looked up at the sky, where the grey clouds were beginning to part, allowing shafts of golden sunlight to illuminate the churchyard. "Home," he said softly. "He went home to wherever time begins and ends." And in the distance, carrying on a wind that seemed to blow from beyond the edges of the world, they could hear the faint sound of a baby crying, not with distress, but with the joy of a soul that had finally found its way back to where it belonged. The silence that followed Silas's disappearance was not empty but full, pregnant with possibilities that the human mind could barely grasp. Martha stood in the churchyard holding an empty blanket, her arms aching with the phantom weight of the child who was no longer there. Around her, the assembled townspeople remained frozen in attitudes of prayer and wonder, their faces reflecting the profound transformation they had all witnessed. Dr. Monroe was the first to break the spell, his scientific mind struggling to process what had occurred. He approached Martha slowly, his medical bag forgotten in the grass, his hands reaching out as if to verify that Silas had truly vanished. "The thermal readings," he murmured, pulling a small thermometer from his pocket and studying its mercury with fascination. "The temperature around us dropped 20 degrees in the space of seconds, then returned to normal the moment he departed." But Martha barely heard his words. She was staring at the blanket, noting that even it seemed different somehow, older, more worn, as if it had aged years in the moments she had held her son. When she touched the fabric, it crumbled slightly between her fingers, threads breaking down into dust that was caught by the wind and scattered across the churchyard. "Even his clothes are decomposing," Dr. Monroe observed with clinical detachment, as if they absorbed some of the temporal energy that was consuming him. Pastor Rawlings struggled to his feet, his face pale with the shock of revelation. The man who had spent months denouncing Silas as an abomination now wore the expression of someone who had looked into the face of the divine and found himself wanting. "What have we done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What terrible sin have we committed against that innocent child?" The crowd began to stir, people looking around with expressions of confusion and growing horror. They were remembering now not just the events of the past few months, but the feeling of lost time being restored to them. Moments they hadn't even realized were missing, conversations that had been erased from their memory, entire days that had somehow slipped away without their notice. Mrs. Henderson clutched her chest, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I remember now," she sobbed. "I remember the day my John was born, the day I lost my mind somehow. It was given back to me when that boy, when he—" Similar realizations rippled through the crowd. A lifetime of stolen moments was flooding back into their consciousness. First steps that had been forgotten, wedding days that had grown dim, the faces of loved ones that had inexplicably faded from memory. The restoration was overwhelming, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Dr. Monroe began moving through the crowd, his physician's instincts overriding his scientific curiosity, as he checked on people who were clearly struggling with the sudden influx of recovered memories. Some were weeping with joy, others appeared dazed and confused, and a few had collapsed entirely from the shock of temporal restoration. "Easy now," he murmured to Tom Morrison, whose face had gone ashen as decades of forgotten experiences rushed back into his mind. "Try to breathe slowly. Let the memories settle naturally." But it was Martha who drew the most attention. She remained standing where Silas had vanished, clutching the disintegrating blanket and staring at the empty space with an expression of such profound loss that it seemed to transcend human grief. She was not just mourning the death of her child, she was mourning the loss of something that had existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death. "Martha," Dr. Monroe said gently, approaching her with the caution of someone addressing a person balanced on the edge of madness, "we need to get you inside, somewhere warm and quiet." She looked at him then, and he was startled to see that her eyes held some of the same otherworldly depth that had characterized Silas's gaze. The proximity to her impossible son had changed her, marked her in ways that might never fully heal. "He's still here," she whispered, her voice carrying a strange certainty. "Not gone, just different, existing in a way we can't perceive." "Martha." "No, listen." She grabbed Dr. Monroe's arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his sleeve with desperate intensity. "Can't you feel it? The way the air moves differently now, the way shadows fall at angles that don't quite match the sun. He's here, Doctor. He's everywhere and nowhere, existing in the spaces between moments." Dr. Monroe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Looking around the churchyard with new awareness, he began to notice subtle wrongness in the environment around them. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, sounds that seemed to echo from nowhere, a general sense that reality itself had been subtly altered by Silas's transformation. The temporal distortion, he realized aloud. His departure didn't just restore the stolen time, it changed the fundamental nature of this place. We're standing at a focal point where the normal rules of causality have been adjusted. Pastor Rawlings overheard their conversation and approached with trembling steps. "Are you saying the boy is still with us, that we can somehow reach him?" Martha turned toward the pastor, and for a moment her face blazed with an anger so pure it seemed to illuminate her from within. "You wanted to cast him out," she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You called him an abomination and turned the whole town against an innocent child. And now that you've seen what he really was, now you want to reach him." "I was wrong," Rawlings admitted, his voice breaking with genuine remorse. "I was blinded by fear and ignorance. If there's any way to undo the harm we've caused—" "There is no undoing," Martha interrupted. "There's only living with what we've done, what we've lost." She looked down at the crumbling blanket in her hands. "My son gave up his existence to repair something we didn't even know was broken. The least we can do is honor that sacrifice." But even as she spoke those words, Martha felt something stir in the air around them, a presence that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was Silas, she realized, but not as he had been. He existed now as pure temporal energy, unbound by the physical constraints that had previously defined him. Dr. Monroe seemed to sense it too, his instruments registering fluctuations that defied measurement. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," he murmured, studying his equipment with growing excitement. "It's as if the very fabric of space-time is alive in this location." The presence grew stronger, more defined, until even the most skeptical members of the crowd could feel it pressing against the boundaries of their perception. And then, carrying on a wind that seemed to blow from outside normal reality, came a sound that stopped everyone's hearts, the faint echo of a child's voice, speaking words that resonated with the power of creation itself. "I am the correction," the voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am the price paid for existence to continue. Remember me not as I was, but as what I became, the guardian of moments, the keeper of time's flow." Martha sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the dual sensation of loss and transcendence. Her son was gone, truly gone, but he had become something greater in his departure. He existed now as a fundamental force of the universe, ensuring that time would continue to flow properly, that the crack in reality he had been sent to repair would remain sealed. "Mama," came the whispered voice once more, so faint it might have been imagination, "don't mourn for me. I am where I was always meant to be, doing what I was always meant to do, and someday when your journey through time reaches its natural end, you'll understand why it had to happen this way." The presence began to fade then, not disappearing but settling into the very foundations of reality around them. Silas was becoming part of the invisible infrastructure that held existence together, a guardian spirit ensuring that time itself would never again leak away from where it belonged. As the sun set over Ashford that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Martha finally allowed Dr. Monroe to lead her away from the churchyard. Behind them, the townspeople began their own journeys home, each carrying within them the restored memories of a lifetime and the knowledge that they had witnessed something that transcended human understanding. The boy who had grown backward through time was gone, but his purpose had been fulfilled. Time would flow properly now, secured by the sacrifice of one impossible child who had loved his mother enough to give up his very existence for the sake of all creation. And in the wind that whispered through the empty churchyard, those who listened carefully might still hear the echo of his laughter, not lost but transformed, becoming part of the eternal song that holds all things together in their proper place and time. 3 days after Silas vanished from the churchyard, the people of Ashford gathered once more, this time not in fear but in solemn reverence. The boy who had grown backward through time deserved a proper burial, they had decided, even if there was nothing left of him to lay to rest. It was Martha who suggested the location, a small plot in the town cemetery overlooking the creek where Silas had loved to play during his early normal years. The grave was dug by volunteers, men who had once hurled stones at the Reddick house now working with coal-used hands to create a final resting place for the child they had failed to understand. Tom Morrison wielded his shovel with particular determination, sweat beading on his forehead as he carved out the earth with an intensity that spoke of deep guilt and desperate need for redemption. 6 feet deep, he muttered to Sheriff Bradley, who worked beside him. Same as any Christian burial. The boy deserves that much respect. Pastor Rawlings had spent the intervening days in prayer and fasting, trying to find words that might adequately commemorate what Silas had been and what he had become. The sermon he had prepared was unlike anything he had ever delivered, drawing not just from Scripture, but from the profound personal revelation he had experienced in witnessing the boy's transformation. Dr. Monroe remained in Ashford, claiming he needed to complete his research, but Martha suspected his true motivation was guilt. The physician had been changed by his proximity to Silas's mystery, marked by forces that had left him unable to return to his former life. He spent his days writing in a new journal, trying to document events that defied every principle of medical science he had ever learned. "There should be something to bury," Martha said quietly as she watched the gravedigger's work, some physical reminder of what he was. She had brought the only remnant of her son that remained, a small wooden toy horse that Josiah had carved for Silas's 3rd birthday. It was one of the few objects that had survived the temporal distortion surrounding the boy's final months, though even it showed signs of the strange aging that had affected everything in his proximity. The paint was faded, the wood slightly warped, but it remained recognizably the toy her son had once treasured. The funeral service was held at sunset, when the golden light slanting through the bare branches of the cemetery's oak trees cast everything in a warm glow that seemed almost otherworldly. Nearly the entire population of Ashford attended, people who had shunned the Reddick family for months now gathering to pay their respects to the child who had saved them all. Pastor Rawlings stood at the head of the empty grave, his weathered hands gripping a Bible that he barely referenced as he spoke from his heart about mysteries beyond human comprehension and sacrifices that transcended mortal understanding. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "not to mourn the death of a child, but to celebrate the transformation of a soul who gave up everything earthly to serve a purpose beyond our understanding. Silas Reddick was taken from us, not by death, but by divine calling, to repair a flaw in creation itself that threatened the very fabric of existence." Martha stood beside the grave, her black dress rustling in the evening breeze, listening to words that gave meaning to her loss without diminishing its pain. Monroe flanked her other side, his medical bag replaced by a small notebook in which he had attempted to record the impossible events they had all witnessed. "We failed this child," Pastor Rawlings continued, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "We feared what we could not understand, condemned what we should have cherished, and drove away the very miracle that God had sent to save us. But in his infinite mercy, Silas forgave our ignorance and completed his mission despite our cruelty." The pastor paused, looking out over the faces of his congregation, faces that reflected shame, wonder, and a new understanding of the mysteries that surrounded their daily lives. "Let us remember Silas not as the strange boy who grew backward through time, but as the guardian angel who sacrificed his very existence to preserve the natural order for all of creation." As the service concluded, the townspeople began filing past the grave to pay their individual respects. Some left flowers, others small tokens of remembrance, but most simply stood in silence for a moment, offering wordless prayers for the boy they had failed to protect. Mrs. Henderson approached Martha with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "I said terrible things, believed terrible things about your son. If I could take it all back." "He understood," Martha replied softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Silas always understood more than the rest of us. He knew you were afraid, and he forgave you for it." When the last mourner had departed, Martha, Dr. Monroe, and Pastor Rawlings remained beside the empty grave as darkness settled over the cemetery. The wooden toy horse sat at the bottom of the excavated earth, a small and lonely reminder of the child who should have been buried there. "It feels wrong," Dr. Monroe said quietly, "burying nothing but a toy. He deserves more than symbolism." But as he spoke those words, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around the grave started to shimmer with the same otherworldly energy they had witnessed during Silas's final transformation. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and shadows began moving independently of their sources, gathering around the edges of the excavated earth, like mourners at a wake. "He's here," Martha breathed, recognizing the familiar signs of her son's presence. "He's come to see his own burial." The presence grew stronger, more defined, until they could almost see the outline of a small figure standing at the foot of the grave, not the infant that Silas had become in his final moments, but the laughing boy he had been in his youth, whole, healthy, and radiant with the joy of childhood. "Mama," came a voice that seemed to whisper directly into their minds rather than through their ears. "Don't be sad. This isn't really goodbye." Martha felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of wonder rather than grief. "Silas, is it really you?" "I'm what I always was," the presence replied, "and what I was always meant to become. The boy you raised, the guardian I needed to be, the love that connects all things across time and space." Dr. Monroe fumbled for his instruments, trying to measure and record this final miracle, but the presence seemed to gently discourage his efforts. "Some things aren't meant to be studied, Doctor. Some truths can only be experienced, never explained." "Will we see you again?" Pastor Rawlings asked, his voice humble with newfound understanding. The presence seemed to smile, though they saw it more with their hearts than with their eyes. "Every time you remember that love is stronger than fear, that understanding is more powerful than judgment, that miracles exist in the spaces between moments, I'll be there." As the presence began to fade, Martha felt compelled to ask one final question. "Are you happy, sweetheart? Are you at peace?" "I'm home, Mama," came the whispered reply. "I'm finally truly home." The presence dissolved then, not disappearing but settling into the very earth around them, becoming part of the foundation upon which the cemetery rested. The grave that had been dug for Silas Reddick would remain empty of physical remains, but it had become something far more significant, a focal point where the eternal touched the temporal, where love transcended the boundaries of life and death. Dr. Monroe was the first to speak after the presence departed. "We should seal it," he said quietly. "Mark it properly so future generations will know what happened here." They filled the grave with their own hands, the three adults working by lantern light to complete the burial that wasn't really a burial at all. When they were finished, Martha placed a simple wooden marker at the head of the plot, carved with words that captured both her loss and her understanding. Silas Reddick, beloved son who gave up time itself so that time could continue. As they walked away from the cemetery that night, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed and participated in, none of them noticed the way the earth above Silas's grave continued to glow with a faint, warm light that would persist for generations to come. The boy who grew backward through time had found his final resting place, not in the ground, but in the eternal mystery of existence itself. And somewhere in the spaces between seconds, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence between words, Silas Reddick continued his vigil, ensuring that time would flow as it should, that love would triumph over fear, and that miracles would always be possible for those with eyes to see them. 27 years had passed since Silas Reddick disappeared from the churchyard of Ashford, Missouri, but the effects of his transformation continued to ripple through time like stones cast into still water. The cemetery plot that bore his name had become something of a pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from across the country who came seeking answers to questions they couldn't quite articulate. The headstone Martha had placed there remained unmarked by weather, its carved words as clear and sharp as the day she had set them in the earth. Martha herself had lived to see 73 years, spending her final decades as something of an oracle for those who sought to understand the mysteries that existed at the edges of human comprehension. She never remarried, never had other children, dedicating her remaining years to preserving the memory of her impossible son and helping others who encountered their own brushes with the inexplicable. Dr. Alistair Monroe had never returned to his practice in St. Louis. The transformation he had witnessed had fundamentally altered his understanding of medicine, science, and reality itself. He established a small clinic in Ashford, treating both physical ailments and what he termed temporal disorders, conditions that seemed to involve disruptions in the normal flow of time around certain individuals. His journals from those years, carefully preserved in the Ashford Historical Society, contained accounts of phenomena that mainstream medicine would dismiss as impossible. Pastor Rawlings had undergone his own transformation, his sermons taking on a mystical quality that drew congregants from neighboring counties. He spoke of divine mysteries that transcended human understanding, of miracles that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, of love that could bend the very fabric of reality. His final sermon, delivered just before his death in 1881, contained these prophetic words: "The boy who grew backward through time was not an anomaly but a harbinger. Others like him walk among us still, guardians of mysteries we are not yet ready to comprehend." The war had ended, as all wars do, but Josiah Reddick never returned to claim his place in Ashford. His name appeared on no casualty lists, his body was never recovered, and military records showed no trace of his service. It was as if he had simply vanished from the world, leaving behind only the memory of a man who had loved his impossible son and the wife who bore him. But the most significant changes were ones that could not be easily measured or documented. The nature of time itself seemed different in Ashford, more fluid and forgiving than in other places. Children born in the town often displayed unusual awareness of temporal flow, speaking casually of events that had not yet occurred or remembering things from before their birth. Adults found that their dreams contained glimpses of other moments, other possibilities, as if Silas's transformation had somehow loosened the barriers between what was, what is, and what might be. The Reddick farmhouse had been preserved exactly as Martha left it, bequeathed to the town with specific instructions that it remain untouched as a monument to the impossible. Visitors who toured the small building often reported strange experiences, the sound of childish laughter echoing from empty rooms, toys that moved on their own, the sensation of small hands tugging at their clothing. But these manifestations were never frightening, only sad and sweet, like the lingering presence of a beloved child who could not quite let go of the world he had been forced to leave. Local folklore had transformed the true events into legend, as folklore always does. Children in Ashford grew up hearing bedtime stories about the backwoods boy who saved time itself, though most of them believed these tales to be pure fantasy. Parents who knew better often found themselves unable to adequately explain the difference between what had really happened and what had been embroidered by decades of retelling. The cemetery plot itself remained the most compelling evidence of Silas's existence and transformation. The earth above his empty grave never settled properly, remaining soft and warm regardless of season or weather. Flowers planted there bloomed out of sequence, sometimes producing blossoms in the depths of winter or remaining vibrant long after frost should have killed them. Most remarkably, visitors who knelt beside the headstone often reported hearing whispered voices speaking in languages that predated human speech, offering comfort and wisdom in words that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the soul. Monroe's successor, a young physician named Dr. Sarah Whitmore, who arrived in Ashford in 1889, became fascinated by the persistent anomalies surrounding the Reddick grave. Her research, compiled over decades of careful observation, documented temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances, and gravitational anomalies that suggested the presence of forces that conventional science could not explain. The boy's transformation appears to have created a permanent nexus point, she wrote in her private journal. A location where the normal rules governing the passage of time have been fundamentally altered. It is as if his sacrifice carved out a sacred space where eternity touches the temporal world. The most haunting testimonies came from children who seemed particularly sensitive to the residual energies surrounding Silas's grave. They spoke of playing with an invisible friend who taught them games from before time began and told them stories about the place where all moments live together. Adults who witnessed these one-sided conversations often found themselves profoundly moved, as if they were seeing glimpses of their own lost innocence reflected in the wonder of young minds encountering mystery. Martha's final years had been marked by increasingly frequent visions of her son, not as the regressing child he had become, but as the eternal guardian he had transformed into. She spoke of conversations that lasted hours, during which Silas would explain the cosmic mechanics of time and the crucial role he played in maintaining the stability of existence itself. These accounts, recorded by Dr. Monroe in his later journals, provided unique insight into the nature of temporal guardianship and the ongoing responsibilities of those who existed outside normal chronological flow. He tells me that there are others. Martha had confided during one of their final interviews, children scattered across time and space, all serving the same function, repairing breaks in reality, maintaining the integrity of existence itself. They appear when the universe is threatened, sacrifice their individual existence for the greater good, and then continue their watch from beyond the boundaries of normal perception. The most chilling revelation had come in Martha's final days, when she claimed that Silas had warned her of future breaks in the temporal fabric that would require similar interventions. "He says the work is never finished," she had whispered from her deathbed. "Time is fragile, constantly threatened by forces that seek to exploit its weaknesses. There will always be a need for guardians, for children who are willing to give up their humanity to preserve the flow of existence." As the 19th century drew to a close, Ashford had become known throughout the academic community as a site of ongoing temporal research. Universities sent graduate students to study the anomalies, governments dispatched investigators to examine the phenomenon, and spiritualists made pilgrimages seeking communion with forces beyond normal understanding. But for all the attention and study, the essential mystery remained intact. A small boy had grown backward through time, transformed into a cosmic guardian, and left behind a legacy that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about the nature of existence. The final entry in Dr. Monroe's journal, written just before his death in 1899, contained this observation: "We have documented the impossible, witnessed the miraculous, and been forever changed by our proximity to divine mystery. But the greatest truth we have learned is this: Love transcends all boundaries, even those imposed by time itself. Silas Reddick gave up his existence, not because he was compelled to do so, but because he loved his mother, his community, and his world enough to sacrifice everything for their preservation. In the end, that love became the force that holds reality together, ensuring that time will continue to flow as long as there are hearts capable of such profound devotion. And so the legend of the boy who grew backward through time became part of the eternal story of human existence, a reminder that miracles are not violations of natural law, but expressions of love so pure they can reshape the very foundations of reality. In the quiet cemetery of Ashford, Missouri, beneath a headstone that marked an empty grave, the presence of Silas Reddick continued its vigil, ensuring that time would flow as it should, and that love would always triumph over the forces of entropy and despair. The boy who never was had become everything he was always meant to be, not a child bound by the limitations of mortal existence, but a guardian spirit whose love transcended time itself, holding all things together in their proper place and ensuring that the miracle of existence would continue for as long as hearts beat with the rhythm of eternity. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all, not how a boy could grow backward through time, but how love itself can become the force that holds the universe together, one heartbeat at a time, for all eternity. If time can be stolen, as Silas showed us, then perhaps it can also be given freely, offered as a gift to preserve something greater than ourselves. And in that giving, in that ultimate sacrifice of self for the sake of all, we discover the true nature of love, not as mere emotion, but as the fundamental force that prevents existence itself from unraveling into chaos and nothingness. The boy who stole time had, in the end, given it back to everyone who would ever live, love, and dream beneath the stars he now helped to keep in their proper courses across the vast expanse of eternity.